Hello and welcome to this virtual Texas Talk. First, I'd like to start by thanking the Fort Bend County Libraries for keeping these programs going, even though we're doing them online and at home these days. I'd also like to specifically thank Donna Adair and Christina Tam for making sure we could get this program to you. In the early 19th century, early Galveston history really did revolve around some romanticized stories of Anglo encounters and Karankawa Indians, of piracy and illicit smuggling, the base of operations for Mexican revolutionaries, and later, of course, Texas revolutionaries as well. But its geographic location as an export-import hub really relied upon the convergence of railroad and sail transportation to the island by the late 19th century. As the preeminent port on the Texas coastline, the Galveston population continued to steadily increase after the American Civil War. By 1890, there were nearly 30,000 residents living in Galveston. Primarily, these residents were engaged in the labor of the port itself, loading and unloading ships, maintaining railroads, maintaining the services in the various enterprises, commercial and entertaining and leisure on the island. By 1900, when the storm occurs, there are more than 37,000 residents on the island. Now, in order to think about Galveston's size in relative position to the other cities in Texas, by 1890 and 1900, Galveston was now the third or fourth largest city. In 1890, Dallas was a little bit larger with 38,000. By 1900, San Antonio had surpassed both. But in 1890 to 1910, this 20-year window around the Galveston hurricane, Galveston was second or third largest in size, but it was the largest port and an incredibly important commercial center for the entire state's economy. In the first map of the slides today, you probably were a little bit disoriented. And if you were wondering why that map of Galveston looked a little less familiar to you, it's because the north-south axis of the map was reversed. And there's a reason why map makers did that on that first map. The city of Galveston on Galveston Island initially rested on the northern side of the island in the bay, with its orientation toward the city of Houston and the railroad network that spread eastward from Harrisburg. Now, as Galveston grew, that commercial district became more refined. There were more 3, 4, 5, and 7-story buildings. By the late 19th century, you would see the cotton exchanges and the opera house. And surrounding that area that we now generally regard as the Strand District would have been a residential neighborhood of upper-level affluent families, referred to frequently as the Silk Stocking District. Now, beyond the Strand and the Silk Stocking District, you begin to spread south, west, and east into more residentially modest family homes. And all throughout the area on Galveston Island, that city of Galveston was really concentrated there at the north side of the island. And that's where the sort of largest property damage will occur. The 1890s in Galveston were a particularly flush era. Galveston's merchant class, those that lived in the Silk Stocking District and made an enormous amount of income from the commercial trade, built extravagant and lovely homes, architecture which now is often open to the public for people to view. As you look at these images from left to right, you see 3 of the more prominent homes that all survived the Galveston hurricane of 1900. All 3 of these were also built in that decade, the 1890s, when Galveston's economy was, for many people, at its absolute peak. The house on the left is the Truby House, the house in the middle, Ashton Villa, and on the right, Moody Mansion. If you get an opportunity to do a little bit of historical tourism in Galveston, you cannot pass up the opportunity to visit these houses when they are open to the public. The heart of Galveston City was, nonetheless, the commercial district. This building, the Levee Building, is a perfect example of the kind of mercantile architecture that emerged in the 1880s and 1890s. We should take particular note of the Levee Building because it is on the roof of this building that the U.S. Weather Service lost its weather recording machinery when the storm blew in about 5 o'clock on September 8th. Although Galveston never developed the same boardwalk culture to the extent of Coney Island or Atlantic City, there were still plentiful opportunities for working class and middle class residents, as well as day trip visitors, to enjoy the beach, arcade-style games, and wading or sunbathing in Galveston. Hurricane watching and weather forecasting were in their infancy in 1900. There was not yet a rating system involving the now all too familiar categories 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1, nor were storms yet bestowed names such as Alicia, Katrina, or Harvey. National weather services in Cuba and the United States did nonetheless trace the storm's path, allowing modern meteorologists to chart its course in August and September 1900. The storm crossed Cuba on September 5th and hit landfall on Galveston Island in the first hours of September 8th. If the mile-per-hour requirements for classification were in use, this storm hit the coast as a Category 2 hurricane with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and began to lose strength over the next 2 days as it passed over Texas, heading north into Kansas. The National Weather Service's man on the spot, Isaac Klein, monitored storms in the Gulf from 1899 to 1901. Klein received information about the storm's approach from Cuba on September 7th and spent some of the day seeking to estimate the storm's impact on the island, as well as making his best possible estimate about where the storm might hit on the land coast. During the storm's devastating arrival early on September 8th, Klein's time was consumed with safeguarding his family and neighbors while watching high water and strong winds devastate the island. In 2000, popular historian Erik Larson wrote a best-selling account of Klein's experiences during the storm. Isaac's storm has begun to appear quite frequently on school reading lists, Texas Gulf Coast Reads programs, and I suspect that many of you interested in the history of the Galveston hurricane of 1900 are already familiar with Erik Larson's account of Isaac Klein's Galveston storm experiences. Rising water from the bay swept into the commercial district, while punishing winds from the storm pushed water in from the Gulf. By early morning, the two bodies of water had become one, and Galveston found itself submerged under 4 and then 15 feet of water. The tight grid of urban commercial and residential buildings to the north were inundated and partially submerged. The large, less dense homes built closer to the coast were entirely swept off their foundations and lost. In much of the city, only the brick and stone structures survived. On this map, the dark areas represent the areas in which total loss of structures and possibly life most unfolded. As wooden buildings collapsed under the pressure of the wind and water, the debris floated atop the rising surface. Acting like battering rams, the timber and walls thrown by the waves pushed other structures down until much of the island was entirely leveled. On Galveston Island the day of the storm, there were 16 large ships in Galveston Harbor. There were also, of course, hundreds of smaller sailing boats and fishing boats, and when the waters receded, they were deposited all over the island. To the north of the city in the bay, those ships anchored there in the harbor battered one of the 2 railroad lines connecting the island to the mainland, making escape by rail impossible. In the aftermath of the storm, the recovery was a slow and heartbreaking process. In an island city of 37,000 people, immediate accounts of the casualties ranged from anywhere from 1 to 5,000. Gradually, as the city became more aware of the fatal devastation, the number of casualties rose to 10 to 12,000, with at least 6 to 8,000 of those fatal. Galveston lost as many as 20% of its residents. And with 6 to 8,000 deaths, the storm remains the most fatal national disaster in U.S. history. Collapsed and uninhabitable houses created a vast need for emergency assistance to the 30,000 residents who survived and emerged from the storm on September 9th. Many intact homes like this one were simply swept off their foundations and floated along the storm surge, deposited among the debris. Although not all houses were entirely toppled, many like this one were pushed off their foundations and had to be demolished nonetheless. In this affecting panoramic view of the island after the storm, we can see some surviving stone buildings to the north, and only a few wooden homes in the foreground. Moving survivors to the mainland was made more difficult by the total destruction of railroad lines into the city. Survivors instead relied on a fleet of small steamships, yachts, and other sailing ships to carry them to the mainland. Removing debris in order to clean the city preoccupied island officials, residents, and volunteers for several months after the devastation. Just 10 years before the hurricane struck Galveston Island, the Galveston Orphans' Home was relocated in 1880 to this location. Devastation to the second floor and roof damaged the Galveston Orphans' Home, and many orphans were lost in the storm. By 1902, the building had been rebuilt. It today serves as the location of the J.P. Bryan Museum. For those Galveston tourists who are looking for a little window into the history of the island, including the occasional exhibit on the hurricane of 1900, I do strongly encourage people to go by and visit the Bryan Museum when it's open. Beginning in the 1860s, after the American Civil War, the region's Catholic diocese began operating a charity hospital, a charity asylum, and an orphanage for the area's Catholic children. Located on the margins of the city, it was incredibly vulnerable to the hurricane high winds and water when the storm struck in 1900. 10 Sisters of Charity strove to keep the 90 children in their care safe. In order to avoid losing any one of the orphans in their charge, the sisters had them leashed together by the wrist. Sadly, this likely prevented any one of the orphans from floating or swimming to safety, and as a result, all 10 sisters and 90 orphans perished. Removing the dead became an urgent issue of public sanitation. Proper care and respect for the lost, as well as the hopeful discovery of survivors, inspired a tremendous but exhausting effort by Galvestonians the first several days following the storm. Initially, the dead were gathered together, wrapped in canvas sails or quilts, and weighed down with stones and bricks before being buried at sea off the coast. Within days, bodies began washing up on shore by the hundreds. By then, large bonfires used for clearing debris became sites of incineration. Very few of the 6,000 to 8,000 dead were buried on the island. The nearly endless search for bodies, their burial at sea, only for them to wash ashore and then to next be incinerated by the thousands of unfortunate men, women, and children, was surely among the most traumatizing experiences for all who survived the storm and also chose to remain on the island in the aftermath. As surviving women, children, and the affluent escaped the devastated city, much of the cleanup was left to the working class island residents. Many came from hardworking black and white families with no means to leave, and in the urgency of recovery, officials pressed young men and boys into service. Those who left the island generally found temporary refuge in Houston. Many more may have made their way onto other urban areas such as Dallas, San Antonio, or New Orleans. The newspapers in these towns could not keep up with public demand for first-hand accounts of the storms, which leaves historians with a rich primary source record of those survivors' experiences. Relief fund campaigns throughout the year raised money to assist the storm refugees. These campaigns continued on for years afterward, raising money for the city's recovery. An outpouring of popular music and drama centered on the storm combined the public's appetite for stories of the horror together with their charitable aims, raising millions for the island over many years afterward. One of the most prominent works of infrastructure on the island today is the Seawall. This emerged as a successful man-made intervention which would prevent any such similar storm surges from deluging the city ever again. The initial seawall was completed in 1904 at a little bit more than 3 miles in length. It created hundreds of jobs and required the raising of a tremendous amount of public and private money. Once the seawall was completed in 1904, steady agitation for widening its length led to increased segments added on and on and on. By 1963, the seawall as it exists today had grown to more than 10 miles in length and has protected Galveston from similar flooding. Storm infrastructure since the 1960s has remained minimal, but increasingly Texas has been calling for an expansion of such barriers to protect Galveston Bay and the many urban and industrial communities along its coast. If a surge like that occurred in the Galveston hurricane of 1900 or in subsequent hurricanes was to press into Galveston Bay, the results, particularly in the refining communities, could be absolutely devastating for the Houston and Galveston area. Nicknamed the Ike Dike, it remains the most urgent Bay Area storm-related infrastructure needed to prevent a storm of this devastation in our communities. Paired with the seawall, Galveston also raised its foundations. Surviving structures were jacked onto concrete and brick supports 5 feet above the surface, while the city artificially raised itself above its previous elevation. All across the city, recovery and reconstruction involved pumping sand and mud under the elevated buildings, pressing and pumping that water away. Consequently, surviving buildings rose, streets and lots were filled, and new houses were built at a higher elevation. The steady pumping of mud and sand and pumping away of water provided plenty of opportunities for young Galvestonians like these to play in the fountains of Sill as that city rose from the storm. As early as 1902, New York's Coney Island thrilled visitors with a macabre cyclorama of the Galveston flood. Visitors to the New York Boardwalk and Carnival could experience tragedy as entertainment. For survivors of the storm, the hurricane could never be more than tragedy. Although Galveston's population and structures were as plentiful 10 years later as they were when the storm hit in 1900, Galveston never truly recovered. It fell behind as Houston rose and rose and rose. The fourth largest city in Texas in 1900, Houston surpassed Galveston, then Dallas, and then San Antonio by 1930. The cause? Oil and gas-led development following Spindletop. And after 1901, the completion of the Houston Ship Channel in the 1910s. Galveston Bay remained an essential port, but the city of Houston had captured the city of Galveston's primacy. Although Galveston's population would continue to climb, it does reach its peak in the 1960s, and since the 1960s, Galveston's population has been in steady decline, now numbering only about 50,000 residents. Compared to the more than 2 million who live in Houston, the divergence between Galveston and Houston following the storm of 1900 is extraordinary. I'd like to end by thanking once again Dawn, Christina, and the Fort Bend County Libraries. For all of you interested in the Galveston hurricane of 1900, I really do strongly encourage you, when safe, to visit the island. Go see the J.P. Bryan Museum. Stop by the incredible collection of artifacts and archival documents at the Rosenberg Library. And when they have hurricane-related exhibits, be sure to see those as well. Take a little time and stroll over the Strand and walk through the streets near these commercial buildings that endured the storm. As a historian, I know that popular books by Eric Larson and Al Roker have been hugely successful. And if you're looking for narrative storytelling that captures the essence of the event, Eric Larson and Al Roker's books are quite fine. But I also encourage readers to dig a little bit deeper. Pick up histories published by professional historians and universities, such as the books by John Edward Weems and Elizabeth Hayes Turner. And again, for everybody out there listening, thank you for your time. Have a great day.